We're now back with our project, and this time we're going to apply some CSS styling to improve the look and feel of this project. And to do this, as ever, we're going to create a style sheet inside of our project directory. So new file, and this is the styles.css. We can link this inside of the head section of our index page with our link. So this is at the same level as our index page. So this is simply the name of styles.css. And we can go over to our style sheet and begin by creating the root font size inside of our HTML selector. So let's begin with the root font size, and I'm going to go for 10 pixels and also a color, which will apply to all the text in our project unless we override it using a selector. So the color I'm going to go for is going to be 212.560, and we can check this is working by reloading the browser, and this is all now taking effect. So now we're going to move on to the game area, which was the main wrapper, and this is the wrapper for both of our stats section and also the image area. This was an ID, so we use the hash. And all we're going to do here is to set some font styling and also the size. So 1.6 rems, some padding, and let's go for padding on the top of 3 rems. This will just give us some spacing at the top of the page just here. So the majority of our styling is going to be broken up into 2 sections. We have the stats section, which is all of the information up at the top here. So we have the score, the number of items on the image, and also the tick and the cross buttons. And then below, which is going to be this whole section here, this is going to be the image area. So first of all, let's target both of these sections, and we can set the minimum height for the small screen. So this was the class of image area, and also the same for stats. The minimum height I'm going to go for 30 VH, which is 30% of the browser's visible viewport. This is going to make our sections a little taller. It doesn't really matter too much at the moment because we have quite a lot of content on the screen. But later on in JavaScript, when we switch between this section and the image, there'll be less content on the screen. For the image area, I'm going to apply a gradient as a background color. Just like the final version, this is going to be the section over on the right or on the small screen. This will be the section at the bottom. So moving down, the image area. We can do this by setting a background as a linear gradient. The first color, I'm going to select 859 EDE. And for the second value, I'm going to go for 696 5DE. Let's check this is working. This is fine, and this gives us this straight linear gradient from the lighter to the darker shade. But I'm just going to set a optional first value of 70 degrees, followed by a comma. And this is going to offset our gradient to be across the page at 70 degrees. Next, the border radius, which is going to apply to both the bottom left and also the bottom right on the mobile view. So for this, we can apply the 4 values, and these go clockwise from the top left. So top left of 0, the top right of 0, 2, and then both the bottom right and also the bottom left values of 3 rem. These have now taken effect on the bottom of our section. Just to see this more clearly, we can temporarily remove our image. So let's comment this out. And this is how the game will look before the user clicks on the play button. Back to our style sheet, and still within the image area, we're going to make use of the display type of flex, which is going to allow us to position all of this text into the center. First of all, let's set the flex direction to be column, so all of our content is stacked vertically, and then we can use the justify content to space this into the center. So since this is our main axis from top to bottom, justify content will center this vertically. We see we have some uneven space on the top and bottom, and this is because of some browser defaults on the level 1 heading, and we'll take a look at fixing this very soon. Just to finish off this image area, let's add some padding all around with a value of 3 rems. So this uneven space at the top and bottom is because of this heading just here. Inside of our index page, if we go to this section just here, this is within the level 1 heading. Let's go into the developer tools and we can see this in more detail. So click on the arrow just here. And then if we hover over our level 1 heading, we can see by the orange section we have some default margin which has been applied to both the top and the bottom of our heading. Now the margin on the very bottom of this heading is fine because this applies some spacing to our text just below. However, to keep things more central in our container, we're going to remove the default margin from the very top. So let's go over to our style sheet and we can now remove the browser defaults. First of all, our level 1 heading, we can do this by resetting the margin on the top to be 0. And also let's give this a new font size of 2.4 rems. But we can still see that there's more spacing on the top than the bottom. Well, if we go back to our index page, this is because still within this image area, we have a level 3 heading with the ID of message. This is going to be used later on to apply a message to the user once the game is finished. But for now, this is still taking up some space inside the DOM. So we can do exactly the same. We can remove the browser default margin on the top. Reset this. And just for later, we can also set the font size to be a value of 2 rems. And this now leaves our spacing more consistent. So this section is pretty much complete. We can now move up to the score section. So we've already targeted the level 3 heading. So let's go up. The score is also inside of the level 3 heading, which we've just taken care of. So now let's move on to our P element with the class of items. And this is going to let the user know the number to compare against. So all we're going to do is to make this stand out a little more by setting the font size to be 2 rems. So the items class. And there we go. Moving down, we also have these 2 buttons here and also the button at the bottom too. So first of all, let's target our button selector and we can add some base styles. Starting with the width of the button and a value of 8 rems. We can remove any default borders which have been applied by the browser. But we still want this to have some rounded corners, so we can do this with a border radius. Some spacing to make the button a little more padded inside. So a padding value of 1 rem. And then we also need to make these a different color and also remove the background color. So if we take a look at the moment, we've got this light gray color. But I'm going to make these buttons just basically an outline like we see on the final version. So we can do this by removing the background by setting this to be a color of transparent. For this image section, this will allow the blue background color to shine through. And also the same for the stats section over on the left. We can then apply this border color or this outline to each one of our buttons. Okay, so inside the button selector, we can remove the background by setting this to be transparent. Then our border. So this is going to be 2 pixels wide, a solid line. And then the color which I'm going to use is going to be A1, E0, E4. And finally, we can change the mouse cursor to be a pointer when we hover over any of these buttons. All we need to do is to set the cursor to be a pointer, and this will change the mouse as we hover over. So just to finish these buttons off, we're going to make sure that the cross button has the red background color. Just like we see here, we have a different color for the tick and also for the cross. And the way we can do this is by targeting the second button. So inside of our index page, here we have two buttons which are grouped side by side. And since these are side by side, we can select either the first or the second child. Further down, we also have our button, which is in the image section, just here. And since this is in a different section rather than side by side, the nth child won't affect this. So we'll see this more clear if we go over to our style sheet. We can target our button and then a colon. We can then target the nth child. Let's add in a value of 2 since we're targeting the second button. So let's go ahead and change the border. We still want this to be 2 pixels and a solid line. But this time we want to use a different color, and I'm going to go for an RGB value. So first of all, red, a value of 241, 152 for the green and 152 for the blue. And since these buttons are now side by side in the DOM, this is going to target the second button. If we change this to be 1, this will target the first one, number 3, and this doesn't affect our third button since this button is completely independent and it's not side by side with these two here. So let's reinstate this. We want this to be the second button. And then we're going to move on to our stats, which was the wrapper for this top section. So this is the area just here. We're going to set the background color and also apply a border around both the top left and also the top right corners. And then also center all of this content into the middle of this section. So just before we add some CSS styling to this section, I'm going to cut out all of the content inside the stats and add a second div nested inside. This div is going to have an ID of stats content. Then we can paste in all the content just inside. Now there is a few reasons why we've done this. First of all, we're going to set the stats section to be a flex container, meaning we can push all of this stats content into the center. And second of all, using JavaScript later on, we're also going to hide this content when the game is not running. So back to our style sheet, and we can target the stats section and then center all of the content. Underneath the button, first of all, a background color. I'm going to go for a value of white smoke. The border, this is going to be 2 pixels, a solid color, and a value of 859 EDE. This border should also be rounded on the top left and the top right. We can do this with border radius. So first of all, the top left value of 3 rems. The top right of 3 rems too, and then we want 0 on the bottom. Next we can set the display type of flex. This is now going to allow us to center our new div in the middle of this section. When using the Flexbox, the default flex direction is going to be row, which is across the page, and we can center across this axis by using justify content and setting the value to be center. Next, to take care of the alignment on the cross axes or the vertical section, we can do this by setting align items. Next up, the padding. 3 rems on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right. And then we can set the text line to be in the center of our section. So we're almost done for this mobile first styling. The next thing I'm going to do is to go back to our index page. And if you remember, when we set all of this content, we also added a class of space Y. We added this to each one of our lines of text inside of the start screen. We did this so we can add some spacing on this Y axis. So we can do this by setting some margin on the top and bottom. So space Y. The margin will add 2 values. The first one is 3 rems on the top and bottom, and 0 on the left and right. Good, this is now looking how we want it, and now if we go back to our index page, we can begin to work with this image section. To do this, we need to uncomment out our image from earlier, and we can also comment out our start screen. Doing this will simulate how our game will look once the game has started. So let's target the image element. So img, first of all the width of 100%. And also let's round the corners with the border radius. Okay, our game now looks how we want it on the mobile view, but now when we stretch the browser to a wider screen, we want to switch around our two sections, just like we see here on the final version. To do this, we're going to add a media query inside of our style sheet. So at media, all screens, and also the minimum width of 600 pixels. So all of the styling from above will be default and applied from the beginning, and then all of the style rules inside of this media query will only apply once the screen reaches 600 pixels and above. The way we're going to do this is by using the Flexbox and changing the flex direction of these two sections to be row. We can do this inside of the parent element, which is the game area. First of all, we need to set the display type to be flex. And the default flex direction is row, so we don't need to add this in. Next, the image area and also the stats. For these two areas just above, we set the minimum height to be 30% of the viewport height. And since we have more screen space available, I'm going to change this to be 50%. Inside of this image area, which is on the right, we want this to overlap the stats section, which is on the left. Just like the final version here, we see that the right section is overlapping just a little. Now, the way we can do this is by using a CSS transform called translate. Translate is going to move our section across the X or the Y axes. So let's take a look at how this works in our CSS by first targeting the image area. First of all, the border radius of 3 rems to give us the rounded corners on all 4 sides. And then we can set the CSS transform. We see that there's lots of different types of transform we can use. There's things such as scale to scale up or scale down the size of our elements. We can also rotate our elements, but the one we're interested in is translate. Inside of here, we can set how far we want to move our elements on the X and the Y axes. So the first one is the X axis, which is across the page from left to right, so 50 pixels. And then the Y axis, which is top to bottom, 500 pixels. This has now pushed our element over by 50 pixels and also down by 500 pixels. We're only interested in moving our element over to the left, so we're only interested in the X axis. So let's just use one of these values, and instead we can use a negative value. Set this to be 3 rems. And this now pulls our image section over to the left by 3 rems, so it slightly overlaps the stats section. Below this, now let's target the stats section. First of all, with some spacing, we can use the flex property and a value of 1. If we then set the value inside of the image area to be 2, our image area will then try to take up twice the available space as our stats section. For this area, we also need to adjust the border radius, so we'll just have this on the top left and the bottom left too. So the border radius, 3 rems on the top left, 0, 0, and 3 rems on the bottom left too. The final thing we're going to do inside of this media query is to account for this translate. We moved over this image section to the left by 3 rems, meaning we now have some uneven spacing on the left and also the right. To compensate for this, we'll add 3 rems of margin on the left hand side. This should take care of our spacing on the outside of the game, but we also need to take care of the spacing inside of the stats section. And we can do this by adding 3 rems of padding on the right hand side. And this is now it for the styling for this project. Next up, we're going to introduce some JavaScript by generating some random images.